Wednesday morning, and I phoned Youth for Christ. I said, we don't know a thing about this country. We've just arrived. Can you take us around and show us? I'd come to know the Lord through Youth for Christ in India. So one of the directors came and drove us in the neighborhood, and we had no transportation or anything. So he took us to a Christian Missionary Alliance church that was within walking distance of where we lived in Toronto. And the reason I remember it was a Wednesday morning is because the pastor said, we have prayer meeting tonight. Why don't you boys come and join us? So that's how it happened. But after my sisters and family joined us about 6 months later, they really loved the music at People's and started attending there. My parents were regulars out there. I started going to the CNMA church, but attended People's quite often, and then got to know Dr. Paul and Dr. O.J., as you knew them well, very famous personalities in Canada. And when I was in my undergraduate studies, People's Church had the greatest following in the country at that time, the largest pulpit reach and so on. Dr. Oswald J. Smith was a very famed preacher. And for Dr. Paul Smith, who succeeded him, to ask me to preach there on a given Sunday was a stunner. I was just in my mid-20s at that time, and I said, how am I going to do this? Stand behind that pulpit, and, there were several thousand in attendance. But that showed you the kind of person he was. He was always an encourager of young people. So I attended quite often, but never became a member there.
Well, you also then returned, when I was pastoring there, Paul Smith passed away. And so you came and did the funeral with me. And then you remember we had Chuck Templeton there.
That's correct.
It was bizarre. Charles Templeton was someone who had been groomed in the same era as Billy Graham. Many thought a better preacher, communicated with Billy Graham. But he fell away from the faith.
Templeton actually preceded A.W. Tozer.
Yep.
About a couple of pastors before that. So the famed A.W. Tozer, and Templeton went to Princeton and said there he got into an intellectual pursuit of faith and repudiated his faith. At that time, Templeton was probably the most dynamic preacher that Canada had known. In fact, Billy Graham, I saw the two of them talking, and Billy Graham saying to him, if you'd stayed on with the Lord, you would have been the evangelist to the world. As you well know, they were good friends. Yeah. And Templeton, till the day he passed away, had the greatest admiration for Billy. And I think the behind-the-scenes story, John, you may also know, is they did connect before he passed away and had some very meaningful conversations on the phone. But to have this vociferous atheist sitting in the front pew while I was preaching at Paul Smith's funeral was quite a daunting situation, because he became a morning broadcaster and was heard all over the country, and really aggressive in his atheism, softened up.
He wrote the book at the end of his life called Farewell to God. It was quite sad. And I remember I took it on television and preached against it. The next morning he called me.
Really?
Yeah, he thanked me.
Really?
He thanked me. It was quite interesting. But it was very surreal, because you were there as the famed Christian apologist, and he was there as the famed atheist, denier, and there we were at this funeral together honoring Paul Smith. So there are great Canadian roots with you.
And one of the great honors of my life, for the family and you there, John, as the pastor, to be so willing to have me come and give the main address at Dr. Paul's funeral. Still fond memories of my friendship with him. He was much senior to me, but a very warm-hearted individual.
Ravi, when we did meet 23 years ago, the world was a mess then.
Right.
But in the years that we have known each other, it seems that it's a reality. Things are, from a biblical worldview, appearing to get worse and worse. And in that 23-year period, you have been shaping and fashioning your message, your ministry. And now we find ourselves on the end of that 23-year period at this level in our friendship with this new book, Jesus Among Secular Gods. Why did you write this book? You invest.
Well, your point is well made. When Dickens wrote The Tale of Two Cities, he said it was the best of times and the worst of times. That was the opening line of his book. If he had been living in our time, I wonder what it is he really would have said in describing the spirit of the age. In the 1980s, I remember watching Francis Schaeffer in Toronto. He came with Everett Koop, and he was speaking at one of the colleges. I was a youngster, just starting out, and I remember him making the comment that the day is going to come in the West when if you mention the name of Jesus Christ, an average young person will say, what are you talking about, or who are you talking about? And I thought that was somewhat overstated, but he was quite on target. So my colleague is here, Vince Vitale, who we served together on this team. And this subject was proposed by the publisher, actually, John. I had done Jesus Among Other Gods, done several years ago. And the publisher came to us and said, so many of these isms are around now. Secularism, humanism, pluralism, scientism, relativism, which somebody once said all these isms should be wasms, but they're still very much isms. How do you respond to these? It was the famed D.V. Hill, the African-American preacher, said some of these isms should be wasms,
Right.
So Vince did the harder work on this, collating the 8 chapters or so. He gave me 4 of them. He took 4 of them, did the intro and the outro and so on, and we worked together. But I think it is possibly in terms of time, this is, I think, my 25th or 26th book. I don't know what it is, but in terms of timing, this may be the most appropriate one we have written. Yeah.
So when you structured the book, you and Vince, and I'm looking here at the chapters, basically a chapter on atheism, scientism, pluralism, humanism, relativism, hedonism, and then a final appeal in chapter 8 to love the truth. Obviously, when you get into a book, you spend time in that first chapter as I was digging through it. And by the way, this book is really hot off the presses. I just got this book, I think, on Thursday or Friday. So
1 week old, yeah.
Yeah, so when you get it, this really is hot. In your first chapter, Altars Against God, it's very gripping there because you talk about these isms, you and Vince, but before you get there, you examine the gods that secular thinkers actually worship. How repeatedly you say they leave their own questions unanswered. And I found fascinating, Ravi, and I think all of us have seen this, the increased anger, the hostility toward people of Christian faith. It existed a long time ago, but there is an intensity now, and you really work through that in chapter 1.
Last year, almost exactly at the same time, I was speaking at the presidential prayer breakfast the night before to the media. And it was a very fascinating opportunity. Many of them, of course, are on television and the printed page. And a woman was in the audience. She came up to me and she said, I have worked in the State Department for 34 years. She said, I've been a career person in this field. She said, I have never seen such hostility and such poison in the air in terms of the way people are treating each other. And she said, on Capitol Hill, the mood is toxic. This was somebody from the State Department. And when I listened to that, I said, well, yeah, we see it, don't we? Just look at how even these hearings are going on. You would never have realized that this kind of a day would come with so much of disruption, so much of rancor, so much of bitterness. And I think there are 3 or 4 dots that have to be connected here. Okay. And number one is the fact that a repudiation of God is right at the base of this. The tragedy of disbelieving in God, said G.K. Chesterton, is not that a person ends up believing in nothing. Alas, it is much worse. That person may end up believing in anything. And he went on to say there are many, many angles at which you can fall, but only one angle at which you can stand straight. Well, we no longer want to stand on absolutes. We no longer believe there's an ontic referent, a point of reference for right and wrong. All of our values are self-referencing. So if our values are self-referencing, we have no patience with anybody else. We don't think of a counter perspective. I mean, I'm not much of a Hollywood fan. I don't watch any of those programs. I'm a reader. But I don't know of any institution that has more award-giving ceremonies than that one. They're always giving themselves awards. And it is a self-deification in process. Yeah. So when God is abandoned, what is left? Basically, politics has filled that vacuum. Politics has become religion. And politics will always stir up antipathy, intolerance, and an aggressive state of mind. So the foundation of God is gone. Politics becomes that next temple, and you add to it sports and entertainment and all of that. what have we got but a culture that has become extremely hateful and extremely hostile? Do you know the only country in the world in which I've had to take security in the university settings is the United States? I've spoken in Indonesia, in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Syria, in all of these places. The only place where I've literally had to take people to protect us, it was one of the Ivy League schools. The anger, all of this under the rubric of tolerance. Tolerance has really become a euphemism for, if you agree with me, we're okay. If you don't agree with me, I have no time for you. And I think this has come from a repudiation of a belief in God. We no longer have love or acceptance of each other, and we are living in some extremely precarious times. Just to present the truth, as you well know, has become a very serious challenge. It used to be where you go to university, did your open forum, fielded the questions, and came back. Now you literally are nursing in your own mind what kinds of questions are going to come to try and trip you up. The questioner is not often looking for answers. He or she is looking for a reason to cause you to stumble. And one wrong word and you're finished. And all kinds of slanderous statements are made and so on. Very tough. Just to point out, one of the leading Canadian universities, I won't name it, gave me an honorary doctorate 2 years ago, one of the most prestigious universities there. And the chancellor objected to my receiving that degree on the grounds of certain beliefs that I had. And the faculty stood its ground and demanded that he bring one statement out of my books or out of my talks that would prove his point. He couldn't do it. So they went through with the doctorate, and he was sitting there right front and center, just a few miles away from where you used to live in your days there. And he came up to me afterwards with his regalia and all, and he looked at me, grabbed my hand, and he said, "That was truly inspiring. I want to thank you for coming." And in one other similar situation, one of the faculty members came up to me and said, "Thank you for silencing the naysayers," when I knew that faculty member themselves as one of the loudest naysayers in the process. This is the West.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Let me talk about the West, because there are a couple of times, you're quite strong about this. You say in the book, you believe that the world is skidding out of control, and that you wouldn't waste a solitary moment in the task of writing this book with Vince if you didn't believe that Jesus' answers provide the only coherent world view. The Death of the West, one author put it that way, is the title of his book. You're concerned. In fact, you say it several times that the West is in big trouble. Western Europe, United States, Canada, Western society. And you say that they are killing themselves, we are killing ourselves by atheistic propositions. Could you expand on that a minute?
Yes.
It's fascinating because it's as clear to us, you articulate it so well, but it's what we're seeing happening with terrorism, ISIS, etc.
By the way, one of the things I want to say about this book, it's worth the price of this book, is Vince's chapter on scientism. Because the academy today wants to build a scientific single vision, that science has all the explanatory power for everything about life. And yet, I say to you, when Martin Luther King received his Nobel Prize, what did he say? Unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. I believe unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. I asked the scientist, which of the sciences gives you the imperatives of unarmed truth and unconditional love? Those are metaphysical propositions. They are not scientific propositions. So if science has a single vision for this world, and yet we are depending on truth and love, where are we going to find it? We're not going to find it in the major discipline that's governing everything else, calling itself the queen of the sciences. So that chapter alone is really worth reading in the terms of this book. But the reason I think the West is on the verge of collapse is before the brute force of naturalism with its clenched fist and the inability to find ethical definitions, moral definitions. What differentiates us from all of the other living entities is that we have moral reasoning, the capacity for moral reasoning. Gertrude Himmelfarb, professor of history and culture, formerly at Columbia University, now Professor Emeritus, wrote a book, Roads to Modernity. She's a brilliant writer. And in an amazing chapter, she makes this comment. She says, the difference between the United States and England on the one side and Europe on the other side was one word. She said, in Europe, reasoning was supreme. A la Descartes and all of the French philosophers, rationalism, reasoning was supreme. And they were going to interpret everything with reasoning. For the English and the Americans, it wasn't reasoning that was at the foundation. It was moral reasoning that was at the foundation of it all. And so she gives a whole chapter to John Wesley. And how between Wesley and Whitefield in their preaching, this moral conscience was stirred within us. Now, if we're going to go back to imitate Europe, and rationalism is going to be the order of the day, think of all the definitions we have lost in this generation. Just think of it. You see, the original temptation of the Garden of Eden was, has God really spoken? Is there an absolute? Is there a transcendent imperative? And beyond that, we were told to do everything that was given to us except to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which means don't play God. Don't become definers of good and evil, because the day you do that, you're going to die. We have played God, and now we have no definitions. We have no definitions of sexuality, no definitions of marriage, no definitions of gender, no definitions of morality. All of these are with our feet firmly planted in midair. Can we really survive with the absence of definitions of that which for millennia have held true? That some definitions go back 5 millennia ago. We no longer believe in those.
And that's why you say twice in that chapter on this issue that your opinion is just a matter of time.
Yeah, and I think one more quick footnote on that is our inability to even understand other religions. Some of the comments I hear about counter-perspectives and other worldviews, flawed, deeply flawed. So into this vacuum of a non-theistic, atheistic framework, naturalism or counter-religious perspectives are coming in like a storm, and without our definitions, we don't know how to stem the tide.
Ravi Zacharias and Vince Vitale have written this book. It's called Jesus Among Secular Gods, subtitled The Countercultural Claims of Christ. There's a website at the bottom of the screen there as you're watching this with the book there in front of you, and you can simply follow the instructions there and order this book. You need to get it. I'd also encourage you to buy a copy for your pastor, for members of your staff. I also would encourage you, if you have a generations pastor or someone that's really working with